universities. I want to begin by noting that just about everyone I spoke to about their acquisition policy said that they were in the process of updating and revising it, and they did not want their policy shared or their name mentioned, maybe a little bit unlike Michaela's experience. Also, many expressed some unhappiness with parts of their policy, but felt tied because final language included in their policy was beyond their control. So I say this for those of you who may also be in this category. You are not alone. The acquisition policy, found in the collections management policy, is the document that outlines how objects and specimens are acquired or brought into the museum for the permanent collection. The policy should include criteria for the objects and specimens it considers for acceptance, who is given authority for the decisions, methods of acquisition, restrictions, and other factors that guide the decision-making. I will touch on each of these bullet points using language that I pulled out of the acquisition policies that I reviewed. So what will be up here, I won't kind of specifically talk about them, but you can see them as I sort of talk generally about each of these sections. Keep in mind that this is just to give you an idea of phrasing your colleagues use, and my hope is that it will give you some things to consider for your own policy. So the criteria. The criteria are the basis for determining what is considered for the museum's permanent collection. All objects and specimens should fit within the museum's collecting mission and goals. Criteria may include quality of the object, condition of the object, storage considerations, duplication in collection, security constraints, exhibition suitability and considerations, value, research such as ownership and provenance, publications and/or exhibitions, clear title, and compliance with state, federal, and international laws regarding ownership and use. Some of the criteria may also be included in other parts of the policy. This does not need to be duplicated, but should be included somewhere within the policy. The authority outlines who has the power to make decisions on what objects and specimens are considered and accepted for the museum's collection. Such authority and levels of authority comes from staff, committees, and the governing board. All acquisitions should be recorded in the board minutes. Several museums have also had provisions for end-of-the-year gifts and the process and authorization for accepting such items. The means of acquisition outlines the methods by which objects and specimens are acquired. Most typically, objects and specimens are acquired through gift, purchase, transfer, exchange, bequest, and from the field. If not already addressed elsewhere in the policy, all title and ownership must be free and clear, and objects and specimens that are to be accessioned by the museum. As you can read from the third statement, some policies go into more detail on what that means in others. If your museum accepts fractional or promise gifts, be sure that is spelled out clearly in your policy. You may want to consider creating a legally binding promissory document for all such gifts and state in your policy that such documents will be reviewed by legal counsel prior to approval. The rights of refusal section outlines reasons why a museum will refuse objects and specimens. Such refusal may be based on illegalities, donor restrictions, or the object or specimen is not consistent with the museum's mission, goals, or collections plan. If you have a statement relating to items left at the museum which were not accepted by the museum and not retrieved by the owner, resulting in potential disposal of such objects, include this language in your receipt of objects or temporary receipt for objects. The language from the third statement here is also reflected on the temporary receipt for objects for this museum. Restrictions. This section is for is for objects that should be considered without restrictions and should include the transfer of all intellectual property, including copyright, to the extent possible. Restrictions are where the language often gets a bit fuzzy. You want a policy that gives concrete guidelines, but we probably have all been in situations where a donor has placed restrictions on their objects, whether for exhibition, loan, use, or whatever. Rather than say that your institution does not accept objects with restrictions, you may want to consider language similar to the first example. Then, depending on the extent of such restrictions, you may want to consider adding language that legal counsel, again, will be consulted to formalize any necessary additional documents. The procedure for acquisition section outlines the steps a museum takes when considering an object or specimen for the collection. Owner should be given a receipt or a temporary customer receipt that outlines the intent of the owner and a description of the object. This section should also outline the means of presentation or review. And I saw in a couple of acquisition policies, there were a few statements stating that when presenting that the curators need to state where the funds are coming from for purchase. The accessioning section should outline the policy as to who has the authority to accession objects and specimens into the permanent collection. The policy should direct staff to maintain complete written records regarding all decisions and activities made on the collection. Some legal considerations are noted here, and this is not already included in other sections of the policy. So I've seen that some museums will list this separately. And as has been mentioned, there should be a section on ethics, unless ethics are included elsewhere in the policy. And I think these are all fairly standard ethical issues that we've seen, though the bottom statement is one that I only kind of really saw in one of the policies that I was looking at, which I thought was an interesting thing to include. So other items to consider for your acquisition policy include a section on definitions. One person or group of persons' definition of one thing may not be the same as others. Don't assume that all people involved with the policy, whether they're staff within the museum or the public, such as committee members, will be on the same page as you in interpreting terminology. For example, have definitions for accession or collections, even gifts and exchanges. Don't include, though, ambiguous language, such as not normally, or while circumstances may occasionally justify some deviation from policy, if there are exceptions, say so. It's much better to be really direct about that rather than having some vague or wishy-washy language. The policy should be clearly stated, sensibly written, and logical. In general, a lot of detail is not necessarily needed. Obviously, those kind of depends on your museum and situation. The acquisition policy should not include specific procedures. Procedures are the process by which the policy is carried out and are outlined in separate documents that Michaela touched on. For example, a document on accessioning procedures. That is the process taken to physically accession an object or specimen into the collection. Typically, procedures are developed by staff and do not need to be approved by the governing authority. They do need to be reviewed by the director and shared with pertinent staff so that all such staff are aware of what the process is. So also, as Michaela pointed out, I found in my research on this topic that many museums do place their acquisition policy online. For those of you that have concerns about your policy, it may be helpful to get to a level of confidence with your policy such that you would feel comfortable placing it online. I also just want to kind of separate sort of policy and one that was listed within the collections management policy is the access policy. So here are just a few sentences that I found in policies and looking and reviewing at. So the access policy is the policy that pertains to access to the collections, not to access to the museum. Included should be who approves access to and use of the collections and related information. Access to collections and its information will be different from museum, staff, public, scholars, and commercial users. Reasonable restrictions should be noted. Reasonable restrictions to the collection should be in place in the best interest and care and long-term preservation of the collection. And also too, obviously, access to the collection is one of the main ways to get access to the collection is having it on view. And so a lot of museums as far as our access policy, just sort of basically state that having it on view makes it accessible to the public and others. So, thank you. So I think we have time for questions, if any of you have things. Yes?
We recently received a collections assessment program grant from IMLS, and I'm wondering if any of y'all have any suggestions on procedure, how we should go about selecting the assessors and those kind of things? No?
So you received a BRIM grant? So,
A CAP grant, yes.
oh, CAP.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't know if we, whatever, bring a microphone or something.
Didn't they offer, like give you 2 or 3 choices, these are the people that are available for you?
25,000 choices.
Oh, usually they give you just like 3 or 4. I don't, so.
No, it's a bunch.
Can you repeat your question?
Sure.
We recently received a CAP grant, and we're just in the beginning process of selecting the assessors, and it's an extremely long list of consultants to choose from, and I was wondering if you might have any suggestions on how we might go about narrowing the field of offers.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that.
I sit on the AAM review committees for accreditation, and so they also hand out a long list of possible reviewers when you go through the accreditation process. I would go through and look at the institutions and look online to see what institutions are represented that are comparable to yours, so that you would be culling through the list and looking at individuals who have similar kinds of experiences or are familiar with your size of museum or regional focus or collections type. And then I would pick up the phone and start calling people that you know within the museum community to see what they know about the individuals. I'm sure that CAP also sent you little bios of the people so that you can you're going to do some just preliminary sorting to narrow it down to a few candidates, and then you can really hone in on finding out about specific people, just a smaller group of specific people. So good luck. It's a great experience.
Yes, we're looking forward to it.
Everybody's there to make sure you succeed.
Yeah.
Do we have other questions?
Is any of this available to us online to print?
Since your collection policy is so long, have you done like an abridged version for staff to hit the highlights that all staff need to know, like not accepting donations at the box office and things like that, and has it been successful? would like to think it's more successful. It is more successful now than it has been in the past. We do have just internal rules about no front office staff or VS people. Nobody at our public interfaces can accept anything. If it's brought to the museum and left on a desk, they cannot accept it. They have to call somebody in collections. And then there's the curatorial staff and registration staff that are available to punt, to make sure that the documentation is in place, if it's going to be a temporary loan or left for consideration. So there's somebody within the collections department who knows the process, who can speak for the department specific if the curator is not readily available. And because we have curatorial staff housed in a separate building from the museum proper, this does happen quite frequently. We do keep our front office folks fully equipped with business cards and cell phone numbers, email addresses, and so on, so that they can just say, oh, thank you, that's a great treasure, but here's a card. I can't do anything, talk to, make an appointment with the curator. So, but it is an issue, and I do have a shelf full of things that were left abandoned 10 years ago. The process for dealing with abandoned property is so lengthy that it's become easier to just shelve it and know at one point we're going to have to do a big cull. We've also been able to funnel some of that material into our education department. So we have assumed people have left these things for public use, for education display, and things have found a good home, but have not necessarily entered our permanent collections. And that's a big maybe a bigger or a more common challenge for natural history, because we do maintain these large hands-on collections to support our classroom activities. And there are, as we continue to enhance and improve our permanent collections, we do de-accession from permanent collections into education so that things can continue on in their life of education in a more immediate and accessible manner. So.
Jennifer, and then you're right.
So our first policy and procedures document was written in 1970. Then 25 years later, it was updated, and now 25 years later, it's being updated again. It's getting really large. So luckily, our agency, being a regulatory agency, finally decided they needed a policy guru. And we went in to talk about the policy and procedures, and they told us policies should be maybe 2 pages. And the procedures are what the lengthy thing is. So how do we respond to that?
I would say from a staff perspective, specific to collections management policies, that the more detail you can provide without going into just operational statements, the better, because at least from my experience, the policy is a communication tool that works to communicate what I do to the trustees, and it provides the foundation for the trustees to dig a little deeper into what the museum is responsible for and what responsibilities they have assumed as trustees in terms specific to collections care and maintenance and preservation and identifying their community role and in the purpose of the collections. If they decide that the collections are no longer the main purpose of the museum, then they can change the policy to reflect that. But at this point in time, we are a collections-based organization. And so I feel like having a little bit more detail is better. Do I believe that they actually read the policy? Probably not on an annual basis. They may thumb through it when I give it to them, but that's not my responsibility. They have the information. What they choose to do with it is, and it has been voted in and is reviewed page by page with the director. So, and there's enough legal eagles on our board that they do actually look at these documents within that perspective. I don't know, for a state agency, yeah, you're in a special category. I don't know how else to intelligently respond.
This question's open for whoever wants to answer it. I wanted to get some comments on collecting for both the permanent collection as well as to have objects in other areas of the collection, such as education, library, and things of that nature. I've got a number of items that are just all generally considered the collection, but really should be kind of divided out to different categories. So if anybody could comment on that, that would help me a lot to figure out how I ought to proceed forth with dealing with what I've inherited.
In our first part of our policy, we talk about the different types of collections. We're in a similar situation. We have our permanent collection, we have an education collection, and a research library collection. And in our policy, we discuss the research library and the education collection, just, kind of an overview that they exist. I think there's a statement in there that, let's see, for both, we record, like in our case, we do a donation agreement. We record the items addition to the museum, to that collection, but they're not, formally accessioned into the permanent collection. So we just mention them very briefly and then kind of move on and the rest of the policy is very much focused on the permanent collection.
Just one little follow-up question on that. So in terms of paperwork, would we still use more or less the same deed of gift kind of, or would we better to have some different type of form for something that's not specifically the permanent collection?
I think it depends on you. For us, we use the same donation agreement, and I have a line for the accession number, and if it's education collection or research library, I put education collection or research library in that line, and then I keep a special file drawer for education collection and a special file drawer for research library. I don't know if that's the norm, but it felt in our situation, it's what I felt most comfortable with, because we are still able to track, the acquisition of those objects, because we have people walk in that, oh, we donated a book to the research library 10 years ago, and it's nice to be able to really have that official. I don't think that's something the museum has always done, but it is something we've done in recent years, and it may just be staff preference.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Any other questions? Thank you, everyone, for being here. And don't forget to fill out your evaluation and hand it to the guy in the back there. What's your name?
I'm Jake.
Thanks. Thank you.
Useful information.
Those doors for you.
Sneak it out.
It would make me laugh and smile so much.
Looks like waiting around.
How are you this morning?
All right, how are you? Oh, good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Fred.
That was a long day.
It was, yeah.
I got you.
Big time. That means we don't have nearly as much.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? All day yesterday, I was the wrong gate. I'm sure they'll figure it out. I didn't realize it was today's court. Oh, well. On you are.
Was that it for
There you
this
go.
session?